We all have priorities in our lives. And the priorities that we have in life gives us some kind of direction and orientation for our lives. If my priority is my career, then everything that I do will be directed towards that. If my priority is my family, I will be always influenced by family and my family life. The question today is God in my priority list the first or somewhere in the last? Hello, I am Father Soney Sebastian. I am a Divine Word Missionary Priest. I like to share with you today on a few of the passages from the Bible. The first reading that I would like to share with you today is from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verses 2 to 6. The Gospel passage from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 12, verses 28 to 34, and depending upon the time we will also go through the passage of the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 7, verses 23 to 28. Now let me say that you're going to listen to these passages. Jennifer is going to read this one for us.
A reading from the book of Deuteronomy. Moses spoke to the people, saying, "Fear the Lord your God, and keep throughout the days of your lives all his statutes and commandments which I enjoin on you, and thus have a long life. Hear then, Israel, and be careful to observe them, that you may grow and prosper the more in keeping with the promise of the Lord, the God of your fathers, to give you a land flowing with milk and honey. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, and the Lord alone. Therefore you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Take to heart these words which I enjoin on you today." The word of the Lord. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. One of the scribes came to Jesus and asked him, "Which is the first of all the commandments?" Jesus replied, "The first is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this: You shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." The scribe said to him, "Well said, teacher. You are right in saying, He is one, and there is no other than He, and to love Him with all your heart, with all your understanding, with all of your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. It is worth more than all burnt offerings and sacrifices." And when Jesus saw that he had answered with understanding, he said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." And no one dared to ask him any more questions. The Gospel of the Lord.
I like to give you a kind of a brief summary of these particular passages. First of all, the passage from the book of Deuteronomy is where Moses is talking to the people of Israelites about how they need to worship God and whom they need to worship. He is taking the law of God that has been given to the people through him, through Moses himself, the 10 Commandments, and he says, love your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your understanding, and with all your might. And that was the regulation, that was the command that he enjoined with them. And that's what we have in the first reading. And in the Gospel, we have Jesus having this conversation with this scribe, this teacher of the law. We are told that as Jesus was leaving Jerusalem, Jesus was going towards Jerusalem as he was leaving Jericho. Remember, this is the chapter 12 of Mark. the scribe comes to him with a question, what should I do to inherit? As well as what is the biggest, what is the greatest commandment? That's what he asks. And of course, Jesus is referring again back to the Old Testament, exactly what Moses was enjoining his people. And then he says, do this. He says, with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your understanding, with all your might, you love God. And then Jesus also adds to that another, and he says, and the second commandment, the greatest commandment, is to love your neighbor as you love yourself. Now, before we get to that particular passage, with this particular the dialogue with the scribe, let me bring you a little bit of a background scenario. As I said, Jesus was leaving Jericho and he is going towards Jerusalem. Now, this is the 12th chapter of Mark. Already Jesus is traveling towards Jerusalem, where his ministry is going to reach its culmination. And this culmination, of course, we all know, is the arrest, the persecution, the death, and later the resurrection of Christ. Now, this particular passage often is also used by the church in the liturgy more or less by the end of the church calendar. Because right after this, we would also be entering into the season of Advent. And this is again a way that the church is asking us also to reflect on the ministry of Christ as it progresses. Now, Christ is leaving Jericho. We are all familiar with the town of Jericho. I'm sure every one of you remembers that one particular incident with the little fellow. Remember the little dwarf, the tax collector, who wanted to have a glimpse of Christ. Zacchaeus. He had heard about Christ, and all that he wanted to do was to have a glimpse of Christ. So since short in stature, he runs ahead. He knew the path through which Christ was going to, be passing by. So he goes ahead. He climbs a sycamore tree, very enthusiastic and quiet, because he didn't want to be noticed by others. He was a tax collector. And he climbs the sycamore tree and he's waiting for Christ. And of course, we also know what happens. Though he wanted to do this, without much of publicity, but when Christ arrives right behind, beneath this tree, he tells Zacchaeus, come down. Oh, to the surprise of everybody. Everybody looks up. And of course, Zacchaeus comes down. And not only that, Jesus says, I want to come to your home. Whoa. He never expected that. So Christ goes to the house of Zacchaeus. And at that moment, he not only had just a vision, he had this wonderful experience of having Christ coming to his home, coming to his heart. And he proclaims, he announces that he is a changed man. That if he has extorted anyone, he is going to return 4 times more. So so we are all familiar with the town of Jericho. So I'm sure after all those incidents, Jesus is now traveling towards Jerusalem, and that's where we have this particular scribe. Even in fact, before this particular scribe comes, we have this blind man, Bartimaeus, who comes to Christ and asks for sight. When he was asked to be quiet, he does not. He shouts all the more louder, and Christ tells him, bring him to me. It's said that he just flings the cloth that was, that he used for begging, and even definitely for covering himself, for everything for that matter, because that was the only possession that he had. He just flings that. He doesn't need that anymore. From now onwards, he's going to be a new person. He's going to be a changed person. He's going to be a true follower of Christ. He's accepting Christ. Christ gives him life. Christ gives him sight. He gives him a new life. So it is after that that we have this scribe who comes to Christ and asks this particular question. And his question, as I said, is, which is the greatest of all commandments? And Christ is quoting the book of Deuteronomy, where Moses tells also the same. Love your God with all your heart, with all your understanding, with all your might. And also Christ is attaching one more aspect, that is to love your neighbor. In fact, that aspect of the law is taken not from the book of Deuteronomy, it is taken from the book of Leviticus. Now remember, during the time of Christ, the scribes and the teachers of the law, they were the authorities on all the laws and regulations that a Jew had to follow. It is said that there were a lot of regulations that someone had to interpret that, make it palatable to the people. And the scribes and the teachers of the law were the experts in it. And it is said, to be exact, there were, they say, about 613 laws and regulations that were prescribed in the book of Deuteronomy, so also in the book of Leviticus. And the job of a scribe, the job of a teacher of the law was to explain, to describe, and to disseminate these laws and regulations. So they were authorities. And such a person is coming to Christ. So remember, he is a person who is knowledgeable about the law. And that's the reason why Christ is not just explaining. He's taking the law right from the source itself and is presenting it back to Christ. And another thing that we need to also pay attention here is with regard to the attitude of the scribe. Now we know there were many times scribes and teachers of the law came to Christ with this kind of questions and arguments. And whenever they came, they had only one motive. Their intention was to find fault with Christ. Their argument of questions and discussions were always to find fault with Christ. And we also know Christ never gave a direct answer as well to any of the questions. He also had a counter question often. But in this particular example that we have, where the scribe is asking the question, what is the greatest of all commandments? He's not asking with any bad intention. That is something that we need to pay attention. He's not asking Christ in order to find fault with him. He just wants to get more information from Christ, because he also regards Christ as another knowledgeable man, another scribe, a person who can interpret the law. And that's the reason why he is asking this particular question. And again, we find Christ also not entering into an argument with him, because Christ knows this man. He understands the intention of this man. And this is something that we need to probably pay attention at the right at the beginning itself. We have a tendency too to stereotype people. When people come to us with questions, or when we meet somebody, when we observe people, we already make an opinion. We categorize people. Maybe because of their ethnic origin, maybe because of the language, the kind of way people dress, the kind of different kind of expressions. All of that can lead us to kind of have a stereotyping of the people. We categorize, and we make an opinion and a judgment already. Bias. Very often we are biased. And that's something which we all, I think, pay attention often. All are not the same. People are different. I cannot compare one person with another just because they come from a particular ethnic group, or they dress in a particular way. But look at what Christ does. Of course, all the teachers of the law, all the scribes, they were the outcasts. They were not welcomed by the people all during his time because they were extorting. They were putting, they were loading upon people. That's the reason why Christ even calls them whitewashed tomb. The teachers of the law, the Pharisees, you scribes, because he says you put a lot of load on the people. You don't even, raise one finger to help the people raise this weight up. So he already had this idea of, because that was the idea that the people had. But Christ does not do that stereotyping here as well. Let's continue reflecting on this particular passage and the kind of message that Christ is giving us today as well. Stay with me. I'm sure you like it.
Do you want to fall in love with God? I'm sure we all want to. The book of Psalms contains the directions. Thousands of years ago, people like you and me talked to God out of the depths of their hearts, revealing an intimate love. Psalms are the expression of the faith in God by people around 3,000 years ago. God was not a mere abstract creator, but was present, involved, and a real person of power and emotions. Now, when we read or listen to the Psalms, we can know the intensity of this love. Entering into the influence of the Psalms, we can find a path to know and love God. To know more about the Psalms, you should get a copy of Father Mike Manning's booklet, The Psalms. It will help you to understand the 150 Psalms better as he has categorized them. He uses the technique of acts: adoration, contrition, thanksgiving, and supplication. Get your copy today and know the categories. Learn to pray with the Psalms.
Call the number on the screen or email us. You can also get it through our website. Get your copy today.
Welcome back. We have been discussing and reflecting on the passage from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 12, 28 to 34, where this scribe, this teacher of the law, comes to Christ with the question, which is the greatest of all commandments. And Christ is, quoting from the Old Testament, from the book of Deuteronomy, so also from the book of Leviticus. He is saying, love your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your understanding, and with all your strength, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. Now, as I said, that is the two things that Christ is concentrating upon is loving God and loving the other, loving the neighbor as we love ourselves. So one question, of course, is who is my neighbor? Now we know Christ has already answered that question. Who is my neighbor? Again, remember that question which was raised to him when he answered a similar question by giving the parable of course we all know, the famous parable, the parable of the Good Samaritan. And that explains to us who is truly our neighbor. Everyone who is in need is my neighbor. Now, when you look at this particular, the commandment that Christ is sharing with this scribe, he says, love your God with all your heart. That's number one. And number two is love your neighbor. But does he stop with that? No. He says, love your neighbor. And how should you love your neighbor? As you love yourself. Okay, so that means I need to love myself first. Unless I have a self-respect and self-love for myself, how can I love my neighbor? That is a prerequisite in order to love my neighbor. Because by loving myself, I will come to know how I am able to love my neighbor. I don't know if you know about these two books. It's quite old. these two books written by one of the Jesuit priests, John Powell. The one book that he has, one of the famous books that he has written is, the title of the book is, Why Am I Afraid to Tell You Who I Am? Why am I afraid to tell you who I am? When you get a chance, if you try to get hold of this book, it would be nice. Why am I afraid to tell you who I am? There's a lot of fear in me. I'm afraid to tell about myself. I'm afraid to expose myself because, there is my weaknesses, my limitations, and I don't want the limitations and my weaknesses to be known by you, to be told. I'm trying to hide them. And then, there's another book that he has written, the second book, which is, the title is, Will the Real Me Please Stand Up? As though in a mirror. What happens? You look at your mirror, you stand in front of a mirror, what do you see? You see your own image, your own reflection. So we are able to see exactly the way we are. And am I able to see that myself? Will the real me please stand up and reveal the true self to myself? There is a lot of discomfort in facing myself. I don't want to face my own limitations. I don't want to face my own problems. I'm trying to run away from them sometimes. And the fact that I do not want to face them, the fact that I'm trying to cover them up, I also do not want that to be known by others as well. And that is a reality that we face every day. They say, not only, that is my inner self, even externally, outwardly, there's a lot of things that we do in order to cover up the blemish that I have. They say the cosmetic industry is the fourth or the third largest industry in the whole universe, in the whole world, because it makes the biggest amount of money. Because we want to have all these kind of cosmetics and put them on so that my true self is not revealed. I have camouflaged it. We want to be trendy. We want to, in the language of the younger people, the teenagers, we want to be cool. And by doing that, we are in fact denying our own values, our own principles. Our true self definitely should be put out before others. In fact, by doing that, I'm telling the other person, my dear, this is what I am. I know these are my weaknesses, these are my limitations. Would you please accept me the way I am? I know it's not going to happen with everybody. Some people are not able to accept me the way I am. But it's okay. It's okay. Because that's the way I am. But when I accept my limitations, I'm able to also behave, I'm also able to interact, and I'm also able to conduct myself the way with those limitations. That's one thing that we need to be aware of when we think about this aspect of Christ, when he says, love your neighbor as you love yourself. So we need to begin to love ourselves first, with the limitations that we have, with the weaknesses that I have. And now another thing, so often we might say, oh, is it not selfishness when I try to start loving myself? No, it is not selfishness. It is not self-centeredness. It is in fact being generous to myself. And unless I am able to be generous with myself, unless I am able to accept the way I am, I will never be able to accept the other. The second aspect that I would like you to pay attention to is the process that Jesus is talking about, about these two laws, two commandments. He says, love your God. Okay, we are fine with that. Love your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your understanding, and with all your might. That's perfectly fine. We all understand that. And then he says, love your neighbor as you would love yourself. So there seems to be three people involved in this. God, that is number one. Neighbor, number two. Love your God, love your neighbor, and yourself, myself. So I first need to love God, then I need to love my neighbor as I love myself. I like you to think in a reversal, change the order. Because unless I am able to love myself, how can I love my neighbor? So my loving towards myself, my acceptance of my own personal self with my weaknesses is the first prerequisite. That's the first commandment, in fact. And once I'm able to do that, then I can reflect it and I can do the loving of my neighbor easily. And when I'm able to love myself and my neighbor, and when I'm able to do that, definitely God is going to be present there. God is in my neighbor. Where is God? God is not there in his physical form today. I need to recognize God in my neighbor. He is living in him, in her. And in order to recognize God in the other person, first I need to recognize him within me. So, let's think about that today. Think about that in the coming days as well. Love God, love of neighbor, as we love ourselves. This self-love has to begin by accepting our limitations. I pray that our life will become more meaningful once we are able to put that into our own practice, our own lives. May the good Lord help us in that regard. Blessings always. Amen.
The Lord is my shepherd, I sing hallelujah, for in God there's nothing I shall want. In fresh green pastures He rests my spirit.